My name is Roger Barrett, and I'll be a moderator for today. You'll be hearing a presentation from Mr. Bill Getman, but before we have just a couple announcements for you. Most classes are being taped, and the video will be available shortly after the conference on the GFOA website. If you would please, all phones should be on mute. Perfect timing. All phones should be on mute or preferably turned off. Mr. Bill Getman is presently serving as a senior pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Before moving to Camden County, he and his family spent 17 years in Woodstown, New Jersey. While not a native, he calls Philadelphia home and his roots, unfortunately for his sports teams. He has spent more than half his life in the Garden State. He and his wife, Sue, have 3 beautiful adult children, all of whom are married and finally on their own, most of the time. And I can relate to that one, so it's okay. I can relate to them. They love being grandparents to their 10-year-old grandson and their 7-month-old granddaughter. Since the subject of ethics in the public arena is a particular importance of Bill, he is honored and grateful for the invitation to this year's GFOA's Fall Conference. If you would please help me in giving Mr. Bill Getman a warm welcome.
I'm going to turn my cell phone off. When I arrived this morning and saw what the subject was of your first seminar, I thought, oh man, it doesn't get any drier than that. This will be a breeze. And I walked in and builded a stand-up comic routine. So if you're still here, really, thanks a lot. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this. As Sharon McCullough knows, I've never spoken in an environment like this before. Mine tends to be church-related, not a big surprise. Oh, and by the way, I didn't say in my bio that my 3 kids were beautiful, but they're not here, so thanks very much. As Michael knows, I changed the subject of or the title of my talk this morning several times, and in fact, changed it since your program was printed. Not a great deal, but it's Ethics in an Era of Fractured Foundations. I don't think we've lost them. I just think they're fractured and questionable. So just make that mental note. I grew up, well, I consider myself a Philadelphian. I grew up in a little town till I was a teenager in the southwest corner of Minnesota, 11 miles from Iowa and 11 miles from South Dakota. As you might know, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, except the county where I grew up didn't even have a pond. So my father purchased a small plot of land across the border in South Dakota on Lake Cochrane, and there he and my older brothers built a summer cabin where we spent most weekends from Memorial Day through Labor Day, and then occasionally a bit of a longer time during the summer. My favorite day of the summer was always the 4th of July, because the extended Getman family, which was huge, would all gather at our cabin to be together for the 4th of July. Every year, ending with my father and my Uncle Ken paddling a small boat out to a swimming sunning raft that my father had built years earlier, where once the sun went down, they entertained the family and all of Lake Cochrane's residents with a fireworks show every year, every 4th of July. The most magnificent year was 1964, when they went out there, started shooting off what normally was about a half an hour show, and all of a sudden they all went off at once. It was fantastic, except that the raft caught on fire. And as my uncle and my father, neither one of them particularly athletic, dove into the lake to swim for shore and safety, the raft and the boat that they'd gone out on sank in the middle of the lake. It was memorable for everyone who was there. There are those today, more than a few years later, who seem to be announcing that all of the rafts are sinking, that the foundations we could once count on are going up in flames. I have several secretaries, one of whom is named Liz. And think about Winnie the Pooh, and Liz is Eeyore. Every morning, every single morning, I walk in and she goes, "Oh, Bill." And we're off to very slow races. When she describes what for the morning is causing her to think we're all going to hell. But she has a solution. And her solution is that we should bring back Michael Landon, which would be a very interesting trick, even for a religious person, and Little House on the Prairie. And if we all watched Little House on the Prairie, we would regain our moral and value center. That's her solution to the world's problems. I'm neither a doomsdayer nor one who believes we can turn back the clock to a simpler time. And therefore, reverse trends in our culture, I would say now in the Western world, of which we're all aware. We know we live in a time of rapid change. You all know that every bit as well as I do. And that long-held, common, trusted institutions, cultural bedrocks, are cracking. And they no longer provide the same foundations they once did, or I would suggest to you, seemed to. Adam evidently reported to Eve, "My dear, we are living in an age of transition." And that's my last religious reference. We can't turn back the clock. We just can't. And I, for one, wouldn't want to. I've been a type 1 diabetic since 1964. Maybe it had something to do with that raft sinking in the middle of the lake. And I lived for many, many years on multiple syringe injections every day to control my diabetes until I got an insulin pump. And it has changed my life. We have all kinds of examples of things that are better, much better. Little House on the Prairie ideology would be woefully inadequate for 21st century challenges. In preparation for this morning, I have to confess to all of you that I've been struck by a few ironies. I shared at least one of these with Sharon and Michael. I've never admitted this to members of my congregation, and if any of you here know any of them, please don't. But I was a huge Boardwalk Empire fan. That show that ran from 2010 to 2014 that portrayed life here in Atlantic City at the beginning of Prohibition. And as Google says, the rules didn't apply. So when Sharon McCullough asked me if I would speak to all of you, my first reaction was, ethics in Atlantic City. Now there's an irony. But it wasn't the only one. As one who strongly believes in the separation of church and state, it's more than a shade ironic to me that I, a religious professional, am addressing you, representatives of local government institutions. But the greatest irony is that I'm addressing financial professionals when the last time my wife, Sue, allowed me to balance our checkbook was in 1977. After a year of marriage and numerous overdrafts that were somehow in her eyes clearly my fault. Because then Girard Bank, anybody remember Girard Bank? Oh, this is scary. I'm older than most of you. And I never agreed on the balance in our checking account. And the very first ATM was named George. And I thought George just gave out money. I didn't realize it was coming out of our checking account. So no one finds my presence here this morning more humorous than my wife, who at this very moment is just down the road in Ocean City laughing about this. So in the midst of ironies, real or perceived, let me give you two simple working definitions for me of ethic, singular, and ethics, plural. For me, one's singular ethic, maybe we have more than one, but let's just talk about a singular ethic, is that internal compass that guides each one of us in our day-to-day lives. We'll return in a few minutes to the origins of my ethic and yours when I'm going to ask four of you to join me on stage and help me with this. Someone in your 20s or 30s, someone in your 40s, someone in your 50s, and someone 60s or older. Guiding compass, internal guiding compass. Ethics, for me, are those particular ways that we live that out, the way we act, the decisions we make, particular ways we treat others, all of which arise from our internal compass. And for you, how you carry out your work. I believe the origins of one's ethic are both internal and external. Without an entire sub-seminar on the debate between nurture and nature, let's suffice it to say we are all a combination of the two. If you wish to debate this with me, please don't invite me back next year. My three children, mentioned earlier, are now 34, 32, and 30. And they came out of their mother's womb with much the same personality they display 3 decades later. Our oldest, Dan, was an aggressive barracuda. Jeremy was our laid-back hippie. And Liz demanded to be heard from the moment she was born and kept all the other babies in the nursery awake until they asked us to leave a day early. But they also, for better or for worse, now reflect more than a few learned characteristics from their parents, not the least of which is our rather left political leanings. So what have been, in our larger culture, the obvious traditional foundations which at least in part form us, all of us? Family, both nuclear and extended. But over the past 50 years, some of you know this firsthand, as the divorce rate indicates, the traditional family unit has fractured, or maybe better yet, has changed. Larger social institutions, which people of my parents' generation and earlier generations counted on in huge numbers and trusted to guide them. Public schools, churches, synagogues, other houses of worship, clubs like Rotary, Lions, Masons, Eastern Star, PEO, my mother's weekly bridge club, where all the news about Laverne was shared around the tables and was overheard, unbeknownst to her, by her children sitting on the steps. Governmental agencies, elected officials, I don't know, maybe even finance officers. Look at what the polls tell us and the diminishing membership rolls reveal. And it doesn't take a Princeton University researcher, my apologies if there are Princeton University researchers here today, to conclude that once trusted institutions are not providing broad-based foundations for my ethic or for yours. And there's one more that I think is much less obvious, but every bit as powerful. And this is where I'm going to ask 4 of you to join me on the stage. Is there someone in your 20s or 30s who would be willing to come up? I promise not to embarrass you, at least not on purpose. So is there someone in their 20s or 30s? Oh, good, come on up. Someone in your 40s? Great, thank you. Someone in your 50s? Thank you. And someone mature, like me, in your 60s or 70s. Please, have a seat. And if you'd sit in order of age, that'll help me a lot. No draftees, only volunteers. This won't be painful, I promise. Thank you very much. You know, I wouldn't have expected this group to have such good humor. Sorry for that. Maybe this is your irony, that you came here this morning, I don't know, to recover from last night's party, and you get called up on stage to join me. There was a theory in the late 60s and early 70s, and clearly there aren't too many of us here this morning who might remember this, and it was a sociological theory, and it stated this: we are where we were when. Is that familiar to anybody? Well, thank me for educating you. We are where we were when. Let me give you an example, and that'll help to explain it. I grew up, I came of age in the late 60s and early 70s. Anybody remember any cultural things going on then? Yeah, a couple. The Vietnam War, in which my brother served, and that strange thing called Watergate. I was late teens and early 20s during that time period. And later on, I was aware of the impact that had on me. Massive? No. But significant? Yes. I am opposed to war in almost any form. Even when it's probably justified, you have to twist both my arms to convince me. I watched my brother and his friends. There are names on the wall in Washington, D.C. of people from that little town I grew up in. It molded me. And I will suggest to you that I became somewhat suspicious of the office of president, thanks to Mr. Nixon. I think we've had some wonderful presidents. But for me, they always have to prove their trustworthiness first before I'm going to give them much slack. I'm not saying these things are right. I'm just telling you that it's part of how I was molded from 1965 to 1975. The theory was, we are where we were when. The theory was that the significant cultural or social events during our formative late teens and early 20s years would have an impact on our perception of things, on our worldviews, on one's ethic, that guiding compass I mentioned earlier. Events that were positive or negative surrounding us have an impact on who we are. I think it's unfortunate that the theory never gained much ground. I was the only one who raised my hand when I asked if you'd heard of it before, because I do think it has immense value in helping us to understand who we are in combination with other things and how we react. So, my 4 volunteers. If we could start with this, introduce yourself, where you're from. I guess everybody has pretty much the same job. Oh, thanks very much. But just a little bit about yourselves, just so I know who you are. Many out there probably know already, but who are you?
My name's Rich. I'm the Deputy Director of Finance for Hamilton Township and Mercer County.
Ah, great, thank you.
My name's Andy McHenry. I'm the CFO for Waterford Township, Camden County.
Oh, hello. Hey, what was your first name?
Andy.
Andy.
It's Adrian, but.
Andy, nice to meet you.
Patty Reike, CFO of Rockaway Borough.
Okay.
Russ Forenza, 22 years in banking, 25 in municipal government, retired budget officer, City of Patterson.
And my contemporary. Okay. Think for a moment, in light of what we've talked about that time period in which you, for lack of a better term, became an adult. Now, our family members may disagree with that, but they're not here. Your formative years. Can you identify one or two significant things that were going on around us? And it might have been nationally, it might have been locally, it might even have been internationally, but just something that comes to mind? Rich?
I'd say the World Trade Center towers being struck at 9/11.
Yep, that might be for all of us, regardless of our age. Andy?
I'm a little older, so I remember cell phones and the Commodore 64s and all the evolution of the computer, which it's amazing what it is now.
Yeah, that Bill earlier seems to have no interest in whatsoever.
He's evolved, actually.
He's evolved. No, that's good. Well,
You're doing good.
I can't tell you, Bill, how much I appreciated hearing that. I still use LegalPad, and please notice there's nothing up on the screen. When I was asked if I wanted that, I just laughed.
Black and white TVs and only 13 channels.
Oh, the little town I was growing up in had one channel, came out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Channel 11. I remember the day NBC came. We thought the world had changed. Yes, yes.
Well, I remember that also, but I just go a little further back further up. In the late 60s, when I first started working at Citibank, it was First National Citibank, we had fax machines that were 4 minute and 6 minutes that you had to wait for the fax to come,
Yeah.
and it was on a liquid wet paper. So you had to pull it out and let
Yes.
it dry before you could use it.
Yes. My first job was to be my father's photocopier in the early 60s. And you put something on a screen, it somehow magically transferred to this pink piece of paper. You took the pink piece of paper, put it on a piece of white paper, fed it through, and it magically printed something. 25 cents an hour I made in my first job. Yeah, those of us who are a little older, mature, can remember significant cultural changes. Okay, the more significant question then. And the answer to this may be no, but can you identify any ways that these very significant changes in our lifetimes affects the way you look at things? I realize that's the first two questions were pretty easy, but this one is the perhaps more difficult. And if no, that's fine. You just haven't gotten there yet.
Say yes.
Yeah. Can you, in a specific way?
About our event?
Yeah, your event. We can come back.
Yeah, we'll come back.
I think they addressed it yesterday, at least with the computers. Everything is out there for everyone to know and to see. And I guess because I was there before computers, I'm more hesitant. I mean, and you know, my peers, they, you know, put all that stuff out there as well, but I am more hesitant of releasing all that information, pictures and all that kind of stuff out there. So it makes me more reserved, I guess.
My wife does Facebook. I do not. Yes.
But my husband's all over it.
Well, we'll forgive him. And every time we go away, I say, don't you dare put out there where we are, because who knows who might break into our house. She thinks it's ridiculous. It's an argument I win.
I believe yes, because Years ago.
Why don't you use the microphone? I think I heard
I
somebody
believe
say.
yes, because years ago, you used to, whatever was on TV, you watched. Now you have all these channels, and kids nowadays don't realize that they have 200 channels and have nothing to watch. We had only 13 channels and nothing.
Or two.
Right, and we had to wait for a show to come on. We didn't have on demand that we could watch it instantly.
Yeah.
Gratifying our-
Yeah, the big event of the week in Laverne was Lawrence Welk. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. He just said his grandmother watched that channel. Yeah, great. Well, I'm done. Let's break. It's okay. It was my parents, but it was all that was on. No offense taken. Yeah.
Well, I've seen all of that, what everybody spoke about, and then when I was a little kid, there was a show on called Howdy Doody.
Yes,
Anybody
absolutely.
remembers that?
It's howdy doody time. Yep.
Clara Bell and Mr. something, whatever his name.
Or
Blubber-
Captain
Blubber or
Kangaroo,
whatever
that
it
was the other one.
I didn't like that one. I didn't
Oh,
watch that
sorry.
one.
Something wrong with you, I'm afraid.
But I guess also, just to say, probably I was a middle of the roader, and I guess as I got older, and what happens to most people, they go from either liberal to middle to conservative. So I
Yeah,
guess I'm
yeah.
very more conservative now in my views and what goes on and what happens, and maybe that's just an age process, I don't know. And
Sure.
you get
sure.
tired of seeing everything that goes on, so you sort of yell at the TV every night and
Yep.
scream at the politicians and call them liars and whatever
Oh,
else.
you and I are more alike maybe than we thought. Well, we certainly don't know any politicians today who could be accused of lying. Did you think of anything?
Yeah, I would just say that the World Trade Center attacks made the world seem a lot bigger and more, there's more to the world. You were coming from a smaller shell and then, realizing there's a lot more out there, a lot more bad in the world that we don't realize.
Yeah, yeah. Did any of you work in New York City or just across the river in New Jersey and actually see it happen? Or did most of us watched it on TV, which was bad enough. Yeah. My nephew worked just outside the perimeter and watched it out their office window come down. And then, they all walked across the bridges to get out. He never went back to work in New York City. He couldn't do it. And I'm not sure all these years later he's even gone back to New York City. It had such a powerful, powerful impact on him. Yeah. Is that right? Oh my gosh. Huh. You remember those things? Yep. Well, I'm not trying to overprove a point. I'm not. Just that the time frame in which we grew up, the things that happened during those time frames, for some of us longer ago than others, but it doesn't matter. They do mold us. Maybe for some of us a lot. My nephew is a perfect example of how it molded him, maybe more than anything else. For the rest of us, maybe not so much, but still things that we think back on and we go, oh, maybe that did have something to do with why I react the way I do. We certainly did learn that the world was a bigger place, or a smaller place, maybe. Yeah. Thank you very much. You don't need to stay up here any longer, unless you'd like to, so that you can be close to what's happening. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me just ask, and you don't have to, but you can just stand up where you are. They mentioned some pretty significant things. Were there other things that when I asked the question came to mind for you about cultural things we've lived through and the ways, in fact, perhaps they might have had an influence on us? Or on our larger culture, not just on us individually? Yeah, I'm sorry? Oh my gosh. I remember sitting in school, in elementary school. There was a knock on the door. The principal came in, called the teacher out. The teacher came back sobbing and finally regained composure and said, "Our president's been shot." Yeah. We were pretty young and thought, But then I remember watching every minute of it on TV. JFK's assassination. Oh, having dinner every night with your family. It was a cultural institution, wasn't it? Yeah. We had dinner every night with my family and had to eat my mother's terrible cooking. So I remember meat that you could beat somebody to death with, meatloaf that was mainly oatmeal. We had a big family, and my father was not rich, and my mother was a terrible cook. Others? Just stand up. I can't see. Yes? Yep. Yep. And along with that, not a criticism, an observation, along with that, parents wanting to make sure they know where you are now when you're out playing, if you are in fact out playing and not sitting in front of a video game. It's a very different time. Anyone else? Yes? Uh, hmm. Yeah. One of the largest, fastest growing industries right now are bomb shelters. Steel things you can bury in the ground, because the more things change, the more they remain the same. We are in another Cold War. Yes? Huh. Was there a time, those of you who have been around for a while, when this would have been primarily men here? Yes, yes. I know, Sharon, you've been around forever, so I remember you telling me that, even though you're only 40. Any others? Yep. Yep. Nobody here old enough to remember the Depression, but we remember the recession. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, yes. That was a fond memory, wasn't it? Yeah. Yes, one more. I'm sorry. Oh, oh. Yeah, yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, crash of the space shuttle. My wife was in the hospital with serious pneumonia, and we watched it on TV. And there are some of us here who will remember watching the landing on the moon. Not a lot, but some. And my father, who thought it was the greatest thing in human history, hollering through the house, "You got to see this! You got to see this!" It was quite remarkable. And then the opposite sort of thing. Yeah. I guess you get my point. That we have these foundational things that have been part of our culture for a long, long time, many of which are not working in quite the same way anymore. And then we have these events, some major, and some, not quite so major, but they do have an influence on us. And they do cause us, perhaps unconsciously, to look at things a little differently. We're running out of time. So what can we do with all of this? Well, my initial answer is not much. It's who we are. It's what has formed us. We can't change our histories. Some of us might like to. Some of us probably don't. We can't go back to Little House on the Prairie days, or as my sister-in-law at 9 called it, LH on the P, and watched it every week with her dad. We can't change things, and in many cases we don't want to. But to be people who live, interact with our families and friends and communities, and for your purposes, fulfill your financial work ethically, we can do this. We can be aware of those things which have formed us. And if we can be aware of them, they arise when we are in particular situations. To let them run wild if they're good, but to try to hold them back if they're things that maybe haven't been so good in our lives. And I would offer a second thing. The cracking of the foundations. Some of those probably are foundations that should just go ahead and be destroyed. But the cracking of the foundations leaves all of us in a dangerous place. And it is that we don't have the same sense of community that we once had. Religious institutions no longer have the same impact. Cultural institutions no longer have the same impact. Clubs no longer have the same impact. The places where we found community, a place to belong, we have to search for new ones. We have to seek them out. We didn't have to seek them out before. They were just there. All we had to do was sort of walk through the door. Well, we now have to seek them out in order to have the kind of influence, positive influence, that I enter into every room believing we all want to have. One last story, and then I'll be done. I told you that I grew up in a little farm town in Minnesota, Laverne. And people in Laverne did not lock their doors. You're going to think this is idyllic. There are parts of it that weren't, but this is true. They didn't lock their doors. Most of us didn't even have locks on our doors. Because if we were away and somebody needed to borrow something, they could just go and get it. Or if there was a sick family member, a neighbor could come over and care for that person. Virgil Thompson, our milkman, knew if we weren't home, he had to put the milk in the refrigerator. Sort of was the symbol of life in Laverne. I'm sure it's no longer that way. I lived there until I was a teenager. In 1967, we moved to the western suburbs of Philadelphia. Talk about culture shock. And the family that never locked its house didn't lock its house. And the very first night we lived there, we were broken into. Fortunately, the garage door was very loud, woke everybody up, and as my father went to the window, saw somebody running across our neighbor's yard carrying whatever he could grab from the garage. We started locking our doors after that, by the way. The next day, the police came, and my father told them what had happened. Police sort of wondering, why was your garage door unlocked? And said, do you own a gun? And my father said, I've never owned a gun. Well, if you should decide to get one, he said, to protect your family and your possessions, you get the message, he said, make sure if you use it and shoot somebody, you do it on your property. Or if that person falls dead on your neighbor's property, drag them back onto your property. True story. Because if he dies on your neighbor's property, you're going to be accused of murder. If he dies on your property, it's just self-defense and all will be good. Our dog was Tiger. Well, Tiger, we're not in Minnesota anymore. Did we bring all that with us? Of course we did. I call Philadelphia home. because my formative years, unlike my brothers and my sister, were lived in the western suburbs, and I've been in the Delaware Valley ever since. I have a different view of life than my older brothers and sister. To a certain degree, they're still living in idyllic Laverne, when I've decided that maybe it wasn't so idyllic after all, and there's other things to keep track of in the world. We all need to know what has formed our guiding principle, our guiding compass, our ethic. And the more we're aware of it, the more then we can live in ways which hopefully are helpful to us, hopefully are helpful to our families and communities, and hopefully are helpful to the people that you help. Thank you very much. It's been a joy to be with you.